This is the session that many people have been waiting for. We have the Brian Behlendorf here, and we have him and his colleagues to thank for having open source. Open source is so big now that I just got a call from the UN that they have Open Source Week that I didn't even know about during June 22nd. They think that, open source is critical for SDGs for humanity. And so I think this is a really important moment as we're talking about funding the commons, as I was talking to David about this and why Advanced AI Society is partnering with Intelligence at the Frontiers, is that a big part of securing our commons is to think through security and think through what are the things we have to keep common. And there's a big movement now, but we don't have a name for it. And I thought, well, why don't we bring to stage someone who has successfully named a movement, open source, and let's hear his story of how did he do that? And then more importantly, what are the lessons for the time now in terms of this new movement we need to have named, which is proof of control, being able to say, for our agentic orchestration, for scaling AI, we need to have security measures. And so we're going to have a great conversation with Brian Behlendorf. He co-founded the Apache Foundation, which is amazing. And then he also co-founder of OSI Initiative. So we're going to talk a bit about that. But, Brian's got this history in open source world, and then he's got also the history in the decentralized world, having running Hyperledger. So I can't imagine a better person to be interviewing and also advisor for Advanced AI Society. So let's bring Brian up to the stage. I think that mic works. Please give him a big round of applause. So we have such a full audience.
Thanks, Tricia.
Who's been waiting to come to your talk. So
does it work? Okay, it works great.
We're on.
It's funny you said the Brian Behlendorf. There actually is another Brian Behlendorf out there. What's most embarrassing is he has a much better GitHub repo, GitHub history, contributor history than I do. So, but yeah, that's.
But he did not take open source public.
Yeah.
To us, you're the to many of us in the room. We have Tor project in the room still. We've got inner archives. So much is built off of a lot of what the community you started. So I'm curious from your perspective. We just heard from Jeff Bernstein talking about the importance of naming something, naming a movement. And we think oftentimes we just have to build the technology, right? And then it's going to take off. And before we get into, talking about proof of control in Web3, I just wanted to get your thoughts on what was your work what were you and your colleagues thinking at the time in terms of naming open source? It was a term that was already out there, but what was your thinking around that and your process around that?
Yeah, so let's turn back the clock 30 years, whatever. The internet was still pretty young. The number of people online was still pretty small. In fact, the tech sector as a whole was still 1/100th of what it is today, right? And the software that was driving the internet before companies like Netscape were started, before Microsoft did, Windows 95, which officially supported the Internet Protocol for the first time. A lot of that software to connect these pieces was open source software. It just wasn't called open source software. It wasn't even at that time called free software. Although the Free Software Foundation started, I believe it was 86, 87, that time frame. But it was academic research software built by the people defining the protocols online, right? The TCP/IP, the DNS, SMTP, as proofs of concept that also happened to run well enough to run in production, right? And the whole air of it was, here's the software to help you get online. It'll help us build one internet.
It came from the government.
No, I mean, the government helped provide some critical funding. Al Gore even can take some credit for having helped leads a lot of the funding for this. But a lot of it was from places like the original ARPANET was. Perhaps government played a convening role in that and saying this might be a good idea, but it was researchers all over the U.S., all over the world, really, places like ISI at USC, places like Stanford and Berkeley, but it was the researchers writing papers, publishing protocols, and then interconnecting their systems and forming kind of ad hoc lightweight organizations like the IETF, which was where they would get together in a radically transparent way and kind of define, here's how this stuff should be built. Does somebody have a better idea? There's this essential humility to it.
Was it still the time of BBSs?
Well, BBSs were popular in the 80s and 90s, and I was on Prodigy, which was like an IBM BBS. There was CompuServe, even AOL was getting started. And I think for a lot of people, their first experience online was in a walled garden like that. But I remember starting as a freshman at Berkeley in 91 going, falling down this rabbit hole of getting an email address and then finding out there was an FTP site somewhere with interesting software, finding out what Usenet was. Does anyone remember Usenet? I think great. Those who have never heard of Usenet are doomed to reinvent it over and over because it was this distributed Reddit, basically. And it was kind of awesome. So that era, right, of the early internet technologists, the people who were the early users, was very much steeped in this. The fastest, most efficient way for all of us to build something bigger and better was to give it away, to be transparent about our work, to be, in fact, there was what was it, John Postel came up with this principle. Somebody might correct me if I'm wrong. Be conservative in what you send, but liberal in what you accept in terms of tolerance on the network, right? So all these kind of low-lying or principles, another one that's very much a part of Unix philosophy was small pieces loosely joined, right? So these kind of, it wasn't even like a constitution. There was nothing formal to it, but this informal era where if we could work together to build something bigger, all of us would be able to pay rent. All of us would be able to have a comfortable life as researchers, but also working now in companies that were connecting online. And we didn't have to own the center of the universe in order to do that. We didn't have to be at the heart of it. So now moving on in time a little bit, right? As the web came up as the first web browsers, which were, again, research projects, the NCSA Mosaic. I don't know if anyone here is old enough to have also used it, but they'd carried that tradition kind of forward, but it was also now a moment when the tech sector was starting to take the internet seriously, where the public was starting to take the internet seriously and start asking questions about, who runs this, how is it governed, that kind of thing. And in that moment, I remember being on a mailing list of other technology developers who we were building on the NCSA web server. I was at Wired Magazine. I was at a couple other companies setting these things up. And we were just sharing patches with each other that were improving this underlying technology. And then, but feeding it upstream to the student developers at University of Illinois, who were kind of acting as kind of the coordinators for releases, right? And then they sent an email to this email list that we were all on, saying, "Hey, sorry guys, but all of us are quitting our student kind of careers and joining this new company called Netscape to go commercialize the web." And we were like, "Great, that's cool. Like, we hope the best for you, but we're kind of happy using this thing here, right? And we'll just continue improving it. And when Netscape's server is better, we'll switch to that." So there's this like pragmatism at the core, but we were also pretty happy with what we had. But there was still this idealistic tinge too, which is in 1995, if you looked at the desktop world, it was 95% Microsoft Windows. Mac was there. It was like 5% of the market of computer users were on a Mac, but you couldn't really say that there were open standards for the desktop. It was one company or another. And we were worried the web would become like that.
Right. In that moment, was there awareness that we're in the browser wars? Like, is that...
I think there was a sense that there could be a war that wasn't just a browser war. It would be an internet war where building websites and sharing information would become like Mac versus PC, where if you wanted to have a meaningful presence, you'd have to do it twice, right? You'd have your website that worked for Microsoft and your website that worked for Netscape, right? And writing a web browser is 100 times harder than writing a web server. So I didn't think many of us thought that there would be open source web browsers. Like that almost was like not anything that I wanted to take on personally. I would just wanted to keep building sites, and I wanted to know that I didn't have to do it for n number of times for n number of the browsers. So I cared a lot about standards because standards had built the internet. Standards, whatever, is why we were able to get to where we were. And so we felt, and we being this group of other developers improving this NCSA code said, why don't we organize this better, not only for pragmatic reasons, so we could use this, but maybe in our hearts of hearts, I hope that we do play at least a small role in keeping the internet from being reproprietarized.
A small role.
And again, I think humility is a part of this, and I want to emphasize that's something that I think is still important today. I mean, just flat. You mentioned you can't mention Web3 now, and a lot of how you talk about the work at Proof of Control. Part of it is I feel like in the crypto space, and I say that having been more adjacent to it, on like the board of the Filecoin Foundation and other things. But I think a lot of people tuned it out or got burned by it by what felt like overinflated expectations that came about in that era.
Right. And actually saying, anyone who works on centralization is negative, is bad. You don't really understand society.
Or just that,
Decentralization will take over.
Or that there's this inexorable push that obviously every app is going to be a Web3 app in the future, right? But there are other things, but my key thing is that humility at the core was what was in the environment when a group of folks said, we need a term that describes this phenomenon. That's more than just what the Apache Software Foundation, which eventually it became a nonprofit around 98, but what these Apache developers are doing, what these Linux developers are doing, because the free software thing, while a lot of us conceded it was really important because it kind of framed software development as an access to the underlying source code and the products you use as a human right, something that I remember looking at back then and going, this is going to be much more relevant in 30 years than today when software is inside every doorknob or every car or every light bulb. Yeah, your ability to have agency over the world around you is probably going to be pretty tied to having access to the source code inside those systems. But that was sci-fi in 1995. At that time, it felt a little bit more like if we could just find ways for companies to be more comfortable when we build websites for them and we tell them it's built on free software, right, that they can support themselves. It was hard to do. And there was this moment that we talked about, right, where as Apache started to get more widely used, when and as other open source software was starting to mature, things like the LAMP stack, if anyone remembers that, started to actually pose a credible threat to enterprise software that companies like IBM and Microsoft would charge enterprises 6-7 figures for. When we felt like we needed a way to up-level the respectability of this community-driven effort and demonstrate that it's not actually at conflict with making money, right? Because a lot of us wanted to make money in this world, and to some degree, the free software movement felt a little bit contrary to being able to build a company.
It was anti-capitalist also. Yeah. That's how it was framed.
Right. And a few years after we rebranded what we were doing as the Apache web server, and it was getting out there and being picked up very widely, and we had the benefit of good timing. We had the benefit of like everybody trying to get online within a short amount of time, 95 to 98, 99. And really lucked out in having some really good other developers joining the project and making it fast, supporting thousands of websites on a single PC, that kind of thing. And what was also really lucky was that when you deployed a web server, hidden in the headers of a response was an identifier that told you what software was running underneath, right? So you could access www.fbi.gov, and hidden underneath it, you'd see server : Apache. Right. And so at one point you could, and in fact, there was a company called Netcraft that emerged. They're still around. They still do this web server survey where once a month they scan the entire web and, send it just a basic request and try to see what software is running behind it. And that was a benchmark that allowed us to see not only are a lot of people we think are using it, actually using it, but like 60%, 80%, I think the highest it got to was 75% of the web was running on top of the Apache web server. So there was this sense that this is big. Another data point that emerged in private conversations we had with some folks at IBM, where they had asked their top 100, I believe it was, enterprises, like the CIOs. How many of you are using free software in your enterprises, right? Like Linux or Apache or these others. and like only 30% of the CIOs said that they were using it. But then they asked like 3 or 4 levels down, like to the systems administrators or IT managers, how many of you are using open source software? And like 99% of them said that they were, because every one of them had it for a DNS server or a print server or something like that. And that was when they realized there was this shadow IT kind of phenomena, this existence of open source that the CIOs never saw because there was never a purchase order for Linux, a purchase order for Apache, or anything that they had to do.
And had you defined open source by the time of the study? Can you just give us a history of the timeline?
Yeah. So in 1998, there was those two kind of pivot points. One specific to Apache, which was when IBM showed up. This ragtag group of developers, with their own small businesses, was like, could we accommodate an IBM showing up and being a part of this community? And we kind of said, yeah, if they followed the same rules that the rest of us follow in terms of working publicly, submitting pull requests, following the Apache license, that kind of thing. And so that happened kind of March-ish, I think, of 98. And then in the kind of June 98 timeframe is when there was a kind of a meeting of a bunch of people from different open source projects or different free software projects with different licenses, often many of them not the GPL, going, is there a way to elevate public awareness of this? And this was partly convened by Christine Peterson from the Foresight Institute. So I want to give credit to Foresight for having had the foresight to be at the center of a lot of emerging stuff recently, as well as Tim O'Reilly. So Tim O'Reilly also had this instinct that there was some phenomenon going on that really just needed a way to be harmonized, a way for people to discover each other and realize that they had a lot of the same interests of heart. Right. And so so Christine convened this small group. It was about 5 people, and like, we should come up with a new term. Christine suggested open source as the term. A bunch of us said that makes sense. And so what is it attached to? Right. And in the Debian project, the Debian free software guidelines had long existed as a way to qualify what third-party software should be included in a distribution of the Debian Linux operating system. Right. And they were a reasonable set of things that actually were about conferring agency to individuals. You have the right to redistribute, the right to make modifications, a set of about 9 principles by which you could evaluate any copyright license in a very objective way, a way that lawyers can generally all come to agreement, like, okay, this makes sense.
So that was the start of the legal defensibility. It already
that was when it was. I mean, it was like a thread that connected a lot of these different related things. So part of it was about marketing and building a level of respectability in the sense that you could use this code and it wasn't anti-capitalist at its heart. It wasn't. You didn't have to. Buy into what all the Free Software Foundation principles were, or what Stallman would say, and yet it was a path to that, right? It was also a legal kind of framing because so many companies are risk averse. So they had to understand, can they use this stuff without worrying about somebody else's IP infecting it, and causing a lot of problems downstream. And it was technical to the degree that we felt like we wanted many of these projects to realize they really depended upon each other and could had lots to share with each other, from how to manage communities to maybe converging on a small set of licenses to make it easier for people to mix and match and build distributions, that sort of thing. So, but it really tapped into this latent possibility that existed out there. And what Tim O'Reilly really brought was this instinct that if you want to start a revolution, you have to help everybody feel like they played a role in building it and pushing it forward, and they don't have to pay a price to have shown up a little bit late. Right, like they can jump on it and not feel like just a hangers on, like they have something material to contribute and become a stakeholder in it. And so he convened this first open source summit kind of towards the end of 98, and that was a bigger kind of conference. That was where it had a couple hundred people, but it was very visibly about saying, here's the leaders of these different projects, and we're all going to work together to reinvent how the software industry worked, to make these underlying tools that had been built to date by very volunteer folks, actually not only respectable, but now integrated into the systems of the world.
And at what point did you come up with a definition for open source then?
So we picked up the Debian free software guidelines, generalized them a little bit, I want to give Bruce Perens a lot of credit for having been, I'm not sure if he was the sole author. I think it was a collaborative build thing, but he certainly led quite a bit of that. But it was a rebranding and an update of the Debian free software guidelines. And that was at that, it was like one meeting after that first where we came up with the name, we kind of agreed to that. And we stood up a nonprofit around this term for two reasons. One was to certify the licenses, because the GNU public license is an open source license, the Apache license is an open source one, but there needed to be a body that did this certification, because otherwise anybody could claim that their license was open source, and you'd have this erosion of trust, right? So this verification, this validation of that, and the second was to go out and advocate for it as a term and police its use. If somebody was trying to call their proprietary license that simply shared access to the code but didn't allow you to modify it and redistribute it, they needed to be called out. They needed somebody with some press, kind of mojo to name and shame, right?
So I think, this is super important to hear. Even I've talked to you so many times about these stories, but every time you talk about it, I learn something new. And I think it's incredible for our audience to hear that there was a moment where you said a bunch of you felt that there was something in the air and a latent possibility to come together, that there was more work to be done to bring more people into the moment. And I see that right now. A few of us have felt this latent possibility. This is why Michael Casey and I came together to start the Advanced AI Society to say, there's all this stuff happening, this thing called Web3. And, Michael Casey's been in this world for so long and legitimizing the crypto space. But I find fascinating that, when at that very moment, IBM came to you all and said, why don't we work together? You all decided, hey, yeah, if you act according to our values and our practices, yes, we can. And I have to say, in the Web3 space, as someone who comes from traditional enterprise data world, and I also had a foot in the blockchain, early Bitcoin buyer, and in the crypto space, but then if I brought up the word enterprise, I was laughed out of rooms. People would be like, well, why would you want to work with a Google or someone who's a centralized player? We're building decentralized tools and everyone's going to be, transacting in crypto, and we're not going to have things. It was just so much ideology. And so I feel like there's a new moment now. And there's a sensing that there's an openness. You heard from some of the talks earlier. Now, we have, these kinds of new Y Combinators for spinning out, these kind of security-minded startups that are using crypto rails, that are using blockchain, that using decentralized tools. And so I'm curious, from your sense, you became the ED of Hyperledger, which is a blockchain, enterprise-based blockchain solution from IBM. What made you be one of the few people who has moved but expanded, right, beyond open source to say there's something there in this decentralized space of blockchain and cryptography and crypto coming together? What was that initial shift for you?
Yeah. So without kind of going into the various twists and turns that my career has gone in, but I've kind of done a little bit of everything. In 2016, the Linux Foundation launched an initiative called Hyperledger with an initial set of partners who were asking, okay, so in the blockchain and distributed ledger space, there's a lot of good ideas, but does it have to be tied to things like burning CPU power as a proxy for political power, which I am not a fan of, and I think a lot of people, especially who are energy minded, are also rather skeptical of. Does it have to be driven as a? Are there things that have to be driven as a public permissionless network where these questions about identity and integrity are really solid ones, right? And so Hyperledger started as a project with some code from IBM, with some code from JP Morgan, with some code from Accenture, from a couple of other big companies.
Enterprise from day one.
And a longer tail of others who were about taking some code that had been used actually in some cases since the 70s to synchronize processes between organizations to build essentially distributed databases resilient to hostile actors, right? A distributed ledger, the concept of that has been around a lot longer than Satoshi. This idea of a chain of transactions that can be independently verified and can serve as a system of record between different parties, right? So it happens that rhymes with the kind of distributed ledgers used underneath Bitcoin and Ethereum and other L1 networks, right? And so it was in a space very adjacent to a lot of the crypto activity. And And insofar as there was enterprise interest in these distributed systems of record, a lot of them were asking, is the best way to do this on top of public ledgers, like Ethereum or Bitcoin as these backbones, which were built for different purposes, perhaps, and not, or should we stand up our own permission to L1s, right? And so Hyperledger was a home for actually a series of different kind of technology clients, if you want to think of it, blockchain client nodes, and eventually one called Hyperledger Bezu, which is an Ethereum client. So you could use Bezu on both permission and permissionless networks. But the question there was kind of similar to other Linux Foundation projects, which is, can we get a set of companies together to work on collaboratively, large and small, on a layer of technology that commoditizes it, that flattens that out to become a common system of node, just in the same way we all use the domain name system. Like, I think it's a really good thing there aren't 4 different competing DNS systems out there, that some of which you have to pay money to use, right? We all pay money to register domains, but we also can take our domains from one registrar to another, right? That system didn't just emerge, and it certainly wasn't something that just one company set up. Like, these kinds of, for something to become like an infrastructure layer of the internet, you have to answer questions about what are the institutions you set up and the technology choices to enable that kind of that build up, right? And the open source ecosystems have long worked by coordinating these horizontal communities of stakeholders, small and large, to make those things happen. So back to your question about
how did you actually, what was your move over into this decentralized space? Was it from like a practical distributed database? This is a security perspective, or what was
the use case that pulled me into working on that stuff was land titles in emerging markets. So I used to say, unlike here in the US, where you can trust your government to hold records accurately.
Not anymore. Not right now.
This is an even more pronounced challenge in the global south, in emerging countries, where the systems of record of who owns what property, if they even exist, and in many cases they don't, right? What we think of as like your county recorder when you buy a house, where the change in title gets made. Those things don't even exist in many countries, and because they don't exist, people who've lived on land for generations can't get a mortgage to be able to take out a loan to be able to build a business, right?
So that was the original use case.
So it was like, there was the thing that pulled me into thinking about blockchains as serving a noble function, not just replacing payment rails or unbanking the banks. As I heard, some people in Web3 kind of say what their mission was. My mission wasn't like disrupt the dominant paradigm. My mission was try to, that's one of those SDGs, is access to capital by the global south. And anyone who wants to speak shit about the SDGs, I'll go fight you in the hallway. But like we should still be committed to thinking about the deep structural issues out there and how the systems that we're building are committed to fighting that. And I did see in distributed ledgers an answer to this: how do we build these systems of record that don't depend on or have an over-reliance on central actors?
Well, in particular, because the internet, as it was developed, didn't really solve for 3 fundamental issues that Web3 does a really good job of, or decentralized tooling does, which is payments, identity, and data privacy. We can get into conversation.
I would challenge you a bit on the last two, but yeah. But
I mean, we can look at social media platforms right now around data privacy. We have not figured out portability. All right, we have not figured out data privacy. How do you?
Well, I don't think Web3 has solved the data portability or the privacy issues for us.
For the 415 panel with our 3 proof.
But I think what we're doing with proof of control is it's a useful framing to address what I think is a big concern of both individuals and companies out there, which is this sense that this technology is running away from us, right? This sense that automation can breed these outcomes that are wildly, not only accidentally might cause harm, but might enable bad actors to cause intentional harm. It's a, and I'm I'm working quite a bit to try to figure out how to like map this to what's going on underneath. But one of the big pillars of proof of control is identity. When an agent is out there acting on somebody's behalf, how do you know that as the on the server side of that, on the recipient side of that entity is actually doing something on behalf of the person it's claiming to. And there's some building blocks that have been developed out there, verifiable credentials, DIDs, those sorts of things, but they haven't really been put together into a systemic package that works, especially when it comes to conferring that kind of agency on behalf that kind of authorization onto agents acting on your behalf. The idea of being able to scope that as well and say this agent is authorized to be able to spend a certain amount of money or consume certain kinds of data. That also feels like a problem that's being solved today by very bespoke means or by piggybacking on top of, well, if it's operating on this user's behalf, then it's anything that agent does, is going to be liability to that user. And I think we can do better than that. And I think things don't scale out unless we have tools for being able to manage that stuff at scale.
I mean, it's a big enough problem that, Linux Foundation is really worried about this. A main threat to all open source projects are PRs or pull requests from agents where you don't have clarity on who they represent. I mean, this was a problem before agents. There was already an incident, that was 2 years in the making where someone already almost maliciously was able to insert code.
This succeeded. No,
They actually
this is
succeeded.
the libz. I forget, there might be a better name for
I
it.
thought they caught it. But
No, but there's a package for compressing data that's very widely implemented inside of SSH and these other kind of foundational tools that was basically maintained by one person who was basically had abandoned it, handed the keys to the GitHub repo to another person who had been showing up and making contributions, who then slipped in a subtle backdoor that we lucked out into noticing. And it frankly could have been a human, right? But AI allows us to automate those kinds of social engineering attacks and do that at scale.
Right.
So the Linux Foundation has in particular for the Linux kernel, are advancing a proof of personhood standard for to try to provide integrity and verifiability to the individuals contributing to the Linux kernel, to try to address the social engineering challenges that can happen in the supply chain of all of these patches landing into the Linux operating system. It's very closely aligned, I think, with the proof of control kind of concepts. But we have these issues and challenges with trust and authorization on the internet and reputation on the internet. And the thing that I would just ask us to consider is how much of it is different when it's agent enabled versus the challenges we already have with humans engaging at scale on projects like the Linux kernel and others. And can we, the same protocols and standards we're using to address those issues, is it about pulling those together, refreshing them, updating them, and making them work? Now, when you can do things 100x, with as much impact for a hundredth of the cost.
I mean, it's going to be case by case, because you saw with the Linux kernel what we announced, with the Linux Foundation. 2 weeks we had a big conference, the Summit on Human Agency, and one of our members, First Person Project, Jim Zemlin, CEO of Linux, announced that they are integrating First Person Project, their entire protocol, into the Linux kernel. And so I think in the terms of case by case, our co-chair for Proof Control, Ken Huang, talks about OAuth was sufficient up to a point for a human-initiated world, but he thinks MCP servers offer a better option, right? Where there needs to be an update, or you see 8004 coming from ERC, where it's like, how do you think about reputation for agents? So there's all these I think some things need upgrades, and some we're going to have entirely new kind of protocols and standards will be needed, but we need someone to kind of pull that together to give guidance, because it's just confusing.
I also feel like, so there was and I know we're over time, so I'll try to make the story short. And somebody might remember the name of this package, but there's an open source project out there, yell it out if you recall, where somebody showed up to contribute a bunch of patches, and they were rejected by the maintainer because they didn't meet his standard for quality. It turned out the entity that had submitted these PRs was a bot who then decided to make a blog post about how awful this maintainer is and try to get back at them for not accepting their patches. And it became a big press thing and exhibit A on why AI and open source have this challenge. What I noticed though was no one was talking about who was the person who put that agent on that path, who gave them the prompt.
Yes, thank you.
Pi Numby, thank you.
The maintainer asked the person who put agent contact them because they couldn't figure out.
And I think the fact that these things don't have a human upstream is a part of the system rejection of it. So if proof of control helps us connect the humans behind the agents to handle these thorny situations, then it's doing God's work.
So really quick summary is that, proof of control is a new category of technology that really is a summary of a bunch of types of technologies that are out there that are using, whether it could be blockchain, decentralized options, or crypto rails. But whatever it is, they offer independent provability that's cryptographically tamper-proof. And it provides evidence that is independently provable. And that is the key. And so my last question for you is, Christian Catalina, I've mentioned this paper before, where it just came out where he circulates essentially the economic theory that the future of AI, the moat is not in compute. That is not, we do not need to continue, yes, we can throw more compute LLMs, but the real moat is going to be in verification technology. That is as AI infrastructure scales, we're going to need more infrastructure in this security round. So he names two scenarios where one's a parasite scenario where AI continues to scale without verification and we lose control, like this, it was this example of the story, but times a billion. Or we have a successor scenario, which is proof of control verification infrastructure is inserted. Which path are we on right now with your hot take before we move on to the next panel?
Well, I found out about the paper last night at midnight, so I apologize for not having read it yet. And even with
my fault, I just told you about it.
And you even did the AI summary of it too. And I was like, still, okay, I need to understand more. I'm not as worried about runaway agents as I am by liability washing by the use of these agents and helping and thereby escaping responsibility by the people who set them on their course. And we have this problem already with corporations where a lot of corporations kind of get away with causing harm in the world because of all these laws that we've built that give the people in that corporation freedom from that liability or, an insurance bubble around it. And let's make sure what we're building is something that actually enhances accountability back to the upstream human rather than, something that just says, these agents go and they do their damage and no one's accountable.
I love that. Essentially, you're making a case that it's like human authorization and human agency becomes even more important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan.
With great power comes great responsibilities.
Yes. Woo!